So, Kirstin, welcome to the Better World Leaders podcast, and thank you so much for making the journey in to see us today.
Thank you for having me.
This has been a little while coming, and I know you've expressed your anticipation of being here. I'm really excited to have you here. It's not every day that I get the opportunity to share a space with a senior executive from an organisation for whom I personally have so much regard, both personally and at an organisational level. So, there we go.
Thank you. What an honour.
Thank you very much.
Hopefully I can live up to it.
Well, no pressure, right? No pressure. So, first of all, just this consistent question, just to give people a little bit of a sense of who they are, who you are, if they haven't encountered you somewhere in the public domain already. So, can you just share with us a little bit of your backstory, your origin, and really what brings you here today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to school, grew up on the Gold Coast, sort of, just south of the Gold Coast, I should say, Tweed Heads, New South Wales side, very important. And I've been in Sydney since I started university. Originally, I studied medicine. I did that for a couple of years and then transferred into law. And then I spent the first few years of my career working as a lawyer in one of the big law firms, before deciding actually that I loved the theory of the law, but the practice of the law was not really what I was as interested in. And so I made the shift across to management consulting and spent a number of years at Bain & Company in Australia and in Canada, working within the financial services practice there. So I've had a number of years of professional services experience as a lawyer and then as a management consultant, but in both of those jobs, I had this really strong sense of sort of the community impact of what I could do with what I was learning in this big corporate space. And so when I was a lawyer, I was very active in the firm's pro bono work that happened. I did a couple of cases for the Aboriginal Trust Fund Remuneration Scheme, and then I carried that through when I went to Bain & Company and did a number of social return on investment cases and worked across the pro bono side of the business as well. So I kind of saw my career as having these two tracks where in my day job, I was working for big corporates and learning a bunch of skills that were incredibly useful. And then in my volunteering and pro bono work, I was able to put those skills to work for community benefit. And that was how I kept my energy up for the corporate grind over a number of years. But all of that started to unravel a little bit for me once I had my daughter. And it unraveled in a bit of an unexpected way. So I went back to work part-time. And what I found was, while I could make the day job work, I didn't have the time anymore to be doing that volunteering pro bono work on the side. And without that, I started to lose interest in what was happening on the corporate side. And so I started looking for an opportunity to bring those two worlds together so that instead of having the corporate day job and then the volunteering on the side, that I could actually have a job that worked for purpose. And that was when I found out about Future Super, got an introduction to the founders at Future Super, and the rest is kind of history.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of points of intercept that I think if this was I'm going to be a little bit condescending to many other very capable leadership podcasters out there, but if this was a standard leadership podcast, I'd be asking you questions about, great, so what did you find the comparative influence of a lawyer versus a management consultant, and tell me about your experience of working with major corporates in Australia versus Canada. But this is the Better World Leaders podcast, so it's all about this momentum that you are building and this, I would imagine, sort of heightening self-awareness of really sort of what fundamentally is sort of getting you out of bed every day. And where I'm going to go, I think we just follow the bouncing ball of the Future Super journey for a moment, but there's a few other elements that we're going to tie in as we go. So where were Future Super on their journey when you first sort of became aware of them?
Such a great question. So I've been at Future Super 3.5 years now. The fund actually 2 days ago just turned 6 years old. So I joined very, very early on in the journey. At that time, Future Super had about 10 staff. We had about sort of $200 million under management, about 6,000 members. And now 3.5 years later, we have just under $1 billion under management. We have around 30,000 members across all of the products that we have. And we have a team of just under 45 across, at the moment, while we're working remotely with COVID, we have team members all across the country. But we do have two main offices in Sydney and Canberra. So my time with Future Super has been coming and joining what was really quite an early stage startup in the fintech space, very, very small, never had a senior management team structure, never had to think about performance reviews for the staff because, you know, the company was 2 years old and career trajectory was something that happened if we were successful, and who knew how to actually do it. So my role has been shepherding that growth within the company, as well as figuring out how we can tell our story and bring the Future Super purpose to life in a way that I think for me, when I joined Future Super, I came from the background of having worked in big corporates and spent a lot of time in financial services. And financial services, I think, is not something that people normally associate with strongly purpose-oriented people. But for me, I'd always really loved it, even in my corporate days, because I think financial services is such a great leveler. If you can make a change within a bank, that affects millions and millions of customers. Insurance is the safety net for all of us if something goes wrong. You know, like pension is what allows us to live with dignity in our retirement. And so I think financial services has a huge amount of power, but it's not often thought of in that way, even by the people who work within those companies. So getting to find a financial services company that had purpose at its core, for me, was just so exciting. And I could immediately see such a huge opportunity for Future Super, both in terms of the impact of what we could do to represent our members and for people to get on board and really support the mission that we had as a company, but also the way we could then influence the rest of the industry and show that you can be a financial services company that doesn't make profit at the expense of people or the planet, that cares about its people and its members and has an impact first, as well as being profitable.
Yeah, absolutely.
I still obviously am so excited by that, and I just think it's such a cool thing to be able to show other financial services that it is possible to think about purpose as well as profit.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the fundamental drivers for me, and to now quote from one of the magical guests from a very similar part of the world to yourself, a guy called Harvey Penny, who lives just the other side of the current wall we have between New South Wales and Queensland. And Harvey founded an accounting firm that had this purpose of enabling good to be done every time they did a transaction. And Harvey's specific sort of calling card is purpose powers profit. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, this is something that I've sort of wrestled with a lot of people in conversation, that there seems to be this inherent, so I think, sort of almost a sort of a heritage sense that we need to distance those two things as far as possible, that we need profit, it's over here and it's primal and we have to focus on that. And then purpose, yeah, it's important, but ne'er the two will mix. And I like you believe that that's fundamentally incorrect, and the more you can intertwine them, actually the better it is for both outcomes, especially at this moment and in these times, and so on and so on. So I'm going to just interject, or might almost intersect, a declaration of my own, which I feel is important, from a sincerity perspective, and sitting across from a reformed lawyer, which is that I am a Future Super customer. That I won't declare how much of that $1 billion is mine, not very much, but that I'm wholeheartedly all in with what you guys are about. And from the very first collateral of yours that I encountered, it was just screamingly obvious to me that there is a better way for an industry which is so easy to criticize for not doing, that there are opportunities, as you guys are creating at Future Super, to intertwine these things and say, we're all about profit, but purpose comes first, and we're going to make profit through purpose. So, having got that off my chest, I feel a bit lighter now, a bit better. Let's talk about your role as a leader and what you believe the role of a leader is in an organisation like this, or really anywhere that the leader is about making things better.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I think maybe I'll answer that in a couple of parts. One, I think, is what is my role as a leader within a purpose-driven company. And I think for me, one of the things that I'm really passionate about and try and bring to my work every day is this idea that being for purpose at Future Super can't be just marketing spin. it can't just be something that we put out to the world and show our customers, but then is not reflected in the way we treat the other stakeholders of the business as well. So we've put a lot of effort into thinking about how we demonstrate our purpose through action across our stakeholders. And so we think about, on the one hand, how do we show our staff the kind of economic system that we envision for the future? How can we role model that for the people who work for us and create that world for them today? How can we think about being the absolute best superannuation fund for the members we've already got, not just the members that we're trying to recruit in through the door? So how can we show our current members through action that we really live our purpose to build them a future free from climate change and inequality, and to help them build that future for themselves? How do we leverage our power as an investor so that we're not just the power that we have as an investor on behalf of our members doesn't just happen at the decision point around what we invest in, what we don't, but how do we leverage that influence over the course of the time that we're invested in those companies, and how do we also leverage that influence for the companies we choose not to invest in, who fall foul of the negative screen? How do we help them become better as well? And then more broadly, as a leader within the business community, how can we use our position as a business to lift the standard of business operations across the country, and hopefully globally as well? How can we show that a better way of doing business is possible? So that's on the one hand. And then I think the other hand is sort of, as a leader within a company, you set the scene for how your people act and how they act both in their role as an interface with others, and then for the rest of their career. So I also think a lot about, like, how am I role modeling the behaviour that I would like the junior staff working for me to exhibit once they get to a point in their careers where they're leading others, where they're managing people, where they're leading companies of their own.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's probably about a dozen different ways that we could come at this now. But I'm going to do a little sort of role modelling. So let's just talk about the team and that sort of sort of setting the example. So if I was onboarding into your team at Future Super at the moment, and I was encountering you for the first time, what sort of behaviours would I expect to see you putting out into the world? How do you set that role model in the right way?
How we set the scene for new staff at Future Super is probably a really good way of answering that question. And everyone who joins the company, we take them through an onboarding process. But the very first step in that is a session with me or one of the other co-founders, where we talk about the purpose. We talk about why Future Super was founded. We talk about what drew us to this purpose. We talk about the company values, and we talk about the way in which we live those day to day. So that's the very first experience that new staff have with Future Super, is getting one-on-one or a small group time with one of the co-founders specifically to talk about the purpose of the business. And I think that's a very, very powerful way for us to make sure that spirit is really core to people's experience with us as an employee from day one.
Yeah, cool. Very cool. So just to hop now into one of the other areas of influence, let's talk about the members. So as an organisation and or your specific role, what are you doing to sort of build the leadership influence that your members?
I think one of the really big things that we try and do for our members as a superannuation fund is we help them, I suppose, understand the power of their money. So superannuation in Australia, it's such a massive industry. There are huge incumbent players, and there's just this perception that superannuation is complicated or that it's boring. It's something that you don't need to worry about until you're close to retirement.
Just very quickly as an interjection, we have an international audience. So superannuation in Australia is essentially this contribution that's compulsory for wage earners and employers that goes towards your essentially pension age income. I don't know, what is the valuation of the Australian superannuation industry as of today in Australian dollars?
Yeah, so it's currently 2.7 trillion Australian dollars. It's the fourth largest pool of investable assets in the world, which for a small country like Australia is a really, really huge thing. So yeah, as you say, it's a compulsory contribution system where wage earners, part of their income is put aside into a superannuation fund and held on their behalf until they get to retirement age. what's different about the Australian system compared to other compulsory retirement or pension systems globally is that we also have the choice as Australians about where we want to put our money. So we can choose a superannuation fund who can manage our funds on our behalf, rather than that just being defaulted to a particular industry or to a government sort of managed or owned enterprise. And so that does actually give Australians quite a lot of choice, but there's this sense that the industry, or that superannuation is boring, that it's too hard, that I don't have to worry about it. And in many ways, the industry kind of is incentivized to make that true. They're incentivized to make it difficult to understand, because one of the challenges we have in Australia is so many people have multiple superannuation accounts, because when you're young and you're working in multiple jobs, you work at McDonald's, they set you up a super fund with one of the industry funds. Then you go and work at your university and you get a super fund with the university industry funds. And so you'll have these young people who get later on in their careers, and they might have 5 or 6 super funds that they've been paying multiple sets of fees on. And the industry is incentivized to make it hard, make it seem complicated, because if people are empowered to take control of their superannuation, they'll consolidate those accounts and the funds will lose members. And so it's a little bit subversive in that sense. And so what we try and do is flip that on its head and say, at its most simple, superannuation is your money that someone else is looking after for you until you're old enough to retire. And it doesn't, while it's important to think about things like returns and fees and things like that have an impact on how much money you're going to have in your superannuation account by the time you retire, that's not all it comes down to, because this super fund is going to be managing your money for you for 50 years for some people while they're working. What that money does in that 50 years is going to determine the state of the world by the time you're old enough to retire and get access to that money. So we try and help people understand, 1, that it is their money, 2, that they can make a decision about how that money is invested, and 3, that the outcome from that decision will actually shape the world that's going to exist by the time they're old enough to spend it.
Yeah, I mean, as a fellow parent, so your daughter's what? Like
She's
4 and a
six.
half?
Yeah,
She's
6 years old.
I have a 6-year-old son.
Ah, so fun.
You just have the one?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I have double trouble. I have a 6 and a 2-year-old. Yeah, I mean, I will at times be prepared to visualise my retiree self, a bit greyer than I am even now, and even more wrinkles. But like for me, I'd be saying, well, that's money which I'm handing the custodianship of over to you, essentially. And primarily how I equate the impact that money is going to have is to guiding the creation of the world that my kids will be living in when they start contributing to super themselves. Right? Because, I mean, that's a big slush fund, right? Like the 4th largest pool of money on the globe of investable assets. That's a truckload of influence.
It's
right?
tremendous.
So where that money goes could be so significant to where the world is, even in 15 years, let alone 50.
And it can be even more short term than that as well, because the thing about superannuation in Australia is a fairly small market. $2.7 trillion goes a long way. Super funds are the owners of around about half of the shares of all of the companies that are listed on the stock exchange in Australia. And so what that means is that superannuation funds are the biggest shareholders in our biggest companies. And that means they have a huge amount of influence in the behaviour within those companies. So they get to, through their voting, they can influence whether companies are short-term focused, focusing on the quarterly shareholder results, or whether they're long-term focused, thinking about how they invest to improve their businesses, how they treat their employees, whether they cut costs in order to deliver greater dividends, all those kinds of things that really shape the world that we live in, and the companies that we're employed by can be influenced by superannuation funds if they're willing to step into that responsibility.
Yeah. So I mean, there was a little potential segue just there about moments of calling that we're going to get to, but I'd just like to continue down this line of dialogue for the time being, and I'd like to ask you a visualization question. So let's say, this episode goes out in early October, and of course we have millions of listeners, so all of those listeners decide to just immediately push transfer and send their superannuation your way. And by, let's say, the middle of November, you've got $1 trillion of deployable assets sitting in your investment portfolio. So the visualization I'd like to ask you to do is what change would you try to induce with funds of that substance, and what would you do that's different to what's being done by the holders of those funds today?
I mean, one of the things that I just think is so exciting about that scenario, and it doesn't even have to be $1 trillion, although absolutely I would love it if Future Super had a third of the superannuation funds in Australia. That would be amazing. But I think even before it got to that point, you'd have other super funds sitting up and taking notice. If they have members rolling out, coming across to Future Super, they've all heard of us. They all know that our mandate is about fossil fuel free investing, ethical investing. We don't even consider companies that breach the industries that are on our negative screen. Even if they're top performers, we won't invest in them. If they start seeing their members rolling out the door and the funds under management rolling out the door to Future Super, we're very, very quickly going to see a change in the way the whole industry in Australia invests its money. And so for me, that's one of the most exciting things, is not just what can we do as Future Super with the money that we manage, but what kind of change can we inspire within the other super funds who see their members leaving to come to Future Super and then want to sort of try and stem that flow of loss of members, loss of money, and loss of revenue for them and so that sort of forces them to improve their own products and make their own products more ethical. But what would I do in that scenario? I think it would be a really, really exciting thing, because one of the impacts of $1 trillion coming to Future Super would be a large portion of that today is currently invested in fossil fuels in Australia. And so massive, massive starvation of funds to the fossil fuel industry, which would accelerate the move towards renewable energy in Australia. Future Super has a really, really strong focus on investing in renewable energy. So a large portion of that $1 trillion would go towards seeding new projects, looking to expand existing projects, and really sort of bring a lot of money into the renewable energy space in Australia. Actually, what we found a couple of years ago, we did some research to sort of counteract this question that transitioning to renewable energy is too expensive and what about the economy, blah, blah, blah. And what we found is that 7.7% of the money that sits within Australian superannuation would be enough to fully fund that transition. So if we were managing $1 trillion worth of money, you can bet that Australia would be a long way on its way towards a renewable energy economy.
Yeah, what a fantastic vision that is, but frustratingly how achievable that vision is. Like you said, it doesn't have to take 15 years. That could literally happen. Well, that transfer of funds could happen in 15 hours. I can vouch, again, not to just fanboy out on Future Super from a customer experience perspective too much, but yeah, I had multiple superannuation funds. I had sat there looking at the form filling and the sort of the cloud of mystery that the industry, as you say, creates around this process. I think it took me all of, I'm going to say 6 minutes to fill out your forms, which were like 3 screens, of an online process. You did all the hard yards. I hope very efficiently automated, of course. And there it went. Easy, job done. And you can have it now until I come and get it when I'm 60. Or maybe I won't need it and you can keep it. So this can happen extremely quickly. And as I like to say, any significant change happens simply by the interval and the number of small changes being compressed and amplified. So the interval between the small steps gets compressed and the volume gets amplified. So that's really all we need. We need a lot of people to make a small step and move their $1,500 or $500,000, whatever it is, to a fund like yours. And this transition, these insurmountable challenges that just seem to go round and around and around on the merry-go-round of political dialogue, will just get done.
I think that's right. And that's one of the things that we've had the luxury of being able to do. We've existed for 6 years. You can make decisions when you're a small company that would be much more difficult to actually implement in a larger company. So I always sort of say, I don't mean to take away from the difficulty or the sort of achievement that we've had. It is much easier when you're managing $0 to have a very, very strict negative screen and to say we won't invest in anything unethical. That's much simpler than it would be for, say, Australian Super to transition its whole $130 billion portfolio to a fossil fuel free approach. Now that doesn't mean it's not possible. It just means that it's not without challenge. But before Future Super started, the sort of received wisdom on investing in Australia was you can't have a balanced portfolio that doesn't include fossil fuels in Australia because they're so rife within our economy. Well, we've shown that that's possible. The received wisdom was that you can't deliver positive returns for members year on year without investing in fossil fuels because they're such a core contributor to Australia's GDP. Well, it turns out you can. And in particular, during times of volatility like we've seen in 2020, funds that have strong ethical screening have drastically outperformed those that are still investing in failing and carbon intensive industries like fossil fuel industry. And so, one of our philosophies is that we show by doing. So you say we can't have a balanced portfolio without fossil fuels? Okay, well, we're going to go and prove that we can. You say you can't deliver returns? Well, we'll prove that you can. And so by doing that, we make it easier for the bigger funds to make those decisions as well. We make it seem less risky for a bigger fund like Hester and First State, who in the last couple of months have both announced their own targets towards carbon neutrality and divestment around fossil fuels. We make it seem much less risky and much less out there for them to announce those targets by sort of being half a step ahead and having already shown that it's possible.
I mean, I've seen your member reports, so can you speak to some of the specific outcomes that you've demonstrated in terms of how your funds have ranked relative to others in recent months?
Yeah, so, just sort of recapping for anyone who has somehow managed to forget the disaster that has been 2020. So we started off the year in Australia with horrendous bushfires that were covering the major cities with smoke. It was dangerous to exercise outside because of the pollution levels in the sky. That really made climate change front and centre for many people in Australia who might have been able to think that it's something that happens far off in the future, it's not going to affect me. We then went straight from the fires to floods, and we went straight from the floods to a global pandemic. And then associated with the global pandemic obviously came a huge amount of market volatility when all of a sudden international travel shut down overnight. Tourism is gone, airlines are struggling, exports have changed because the demand for exported products is has dropped. Entertainment has completely fallen through the floor. So when it comes to ethical screening, a lot of those things fall foul of our negative screen. So we don't invest in airlines because they're such high polluters. We don't invest in alcohol, tobacco, gaming because of the impact that they have within societies and the sort of inequality that they cause. We don't invest in fossil fuels or service providers to fossil fuels. So all of these industries that have taken a massive dive as a result of the global pandemic, our members have been protected from those losses that other superannuation funds have experienced. And the result of that has been really, really amazing. Again, for a fund that's only 5 years old, we actually had at Future Super the number 1, number 2, and number 3 best performing options within the balance category as at the end of financial year. And I'm not sure that that's ever happened before, where one manager would have all 3 of the top performing funds, but we managed to achieve it. So very, very proud of being able to showcase such a positive result for our members off the back of making those ethical decisions. I think there were a lot of Future Super members who were, kind of saying a bit of "I told you so" to their sort of friends and relatives who might have thought that it was a risky decision to move their superannuation to Future Super. We certainly showed that not only was it not risky, it actually has paid off for those members during this time of volatility. Now, if I can just say very quickly, legally I have to say past performance is not a reliable indicator of future performance, but in this case we do have a really, really amazing story that's come out of this time of volatility. And I think one thing that we seem to be all agreeing on is that COVID's not going to be the last of these global pandemics, and this sort of disruption and volatility is likely to be the new normal. And so I think any investors who are still looking at the way things were 2019 and earlier and refusing to make a change, people who have trusted them with their money have a right to ask them why.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd just like to just sort of pause for a moment to celebrate that accomplishment, because if you don't know, I certainly don't know whether this is unique, and let's obviously hope that it's repeated. But repeated, I'm going to sort of somewhat ingraciously say not necessarily by you guys, right? I mean, what I love the most about what the way that you've been sort of portraying this influence that you would like Future Super as a leading organisation to have is one which is very much along the systems thinking approach, and an analogy that was brought to us by a guest just a few episodes ago, Lynn Gorison, where she was talking about the example of the founder of Visa, that he was looking at this similar way of influencing the world of access to credit and effective retail transactions, not by one of envisioning total dominance, but essentially how can we show that there is a better way of doing this. And his one from many sort of mantra didn't lead to the creation of MasterCard, but he was always saying we're going to pioneer, we're going to show the way. Yeah, it's going to take a while, but essentially that's how you create a movement, not just simply a success.
I think that's right. Yeah, and that's very much the approach that we take. Is we publish all of the companies that we invest in. We have our full portfolio available. Any other super funds or investors who want to understand how we do what we do, we're very happy to sort of sit down and share the approach, talk through with them, and we celebrate when these announcements are made. I mean, when Hester and First State Super made their announcements in the last couple of months, we shouted about it from our social media because we're just so excited to see this change happening across the industry. I mean, I would love to see them reach carbon neutral well before 2050, but it's a first step to have some really major players within the superannuation space in Australia making really solid commitments. So I think we should celebrate that and then still push them to go faster.
I was just about to say, you keep doing what you're doing, they're going to get there before 2050.
I hope absolutely. So. Yeah.
Very good. So I think I'm just going to sort of kind of back up a little bit now and come back to those moments of meaning. So I would hope by this point, anybody listening to this that's in a leadership role that isn't right now leading a for-purpose organisation is going to be considering, right, well, okay, so Kirstin's made this shift. She was a successful lawyer. She was working at one of the global iconic consulting brands. And then she's taken this risk, right? She's taken this leap, this tiny little venture, this startup in this industry full of behemoths. Like, that's punt, right? So what were your specific moments of calling that activated that decision-making process?
So I think the big one for me, I kind of alluded to this earlier, was just the mindset shift and also priority shift of becoming a parent. So I still worked at Bain & Company for a number of years after having my daughter, and was in the very fortunate position of being able to trial a lot of flexible working models. I worked in a job share arrangement. I worked part-time, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, shorter days. I got a huge amount of support, but what I wasn't able to do was sort of find the time to do the volunteering work that gave my work meaning. And then on top of that, you have a newborn, you're up late at night, feeding and looking after this child, scrolling through my phone and reading a bunch of reports that were being released at the time to do with climate change forecasts, and doing the very basic maths of thinking, well, if in 2040 we're going to have massive wildfires and food shortages and there's going to be no coral reefs left because the oceans are going to be so warm, well, this tiny little person is going to be 26 years old at that time. She's going to be younger than I am now. And, when you're a parent of a newborn, they're just this blank canvas, and you have so many hopes and dreams for this small person of what they can go out and achieve. And just this realization that my hopes for her and her ambition for herself is going to be curtailed by the kind of world that she's going to inherit. And I just had this moment of thinking, here I am, I'm motivated, I love my job, I think I'm pretty clever and I think I'm pretty good at it, but I'm spending all of my mental energy and all of my talent on something that's not going to move the needle for the world that she's going to inherit. And I'm justifying that on the basis of, well, I'm learning over here so that I can put those skills to work in the community in a volunteer capacity, and maybe one day I'll go and sit on the board of a not-for-profit or whatever. But I just wasn't able to keep that cognitive dissonance anymore once I had that realization. And I just thought, I can't be spending 95% of my mental energy in order to have the right to make good with the 5% that's left over. And so I really wanted to flip that balance and make sure that what I was doing every day with the main sort of focus of my brain was actually contributing to making a better world for her by the time she was my age.
No, I mean, I had a similar, I think, iteration of poignant, salient moments of calling. I think this is consistent for many people. You look at for the first time, for some people, you're infant child and everything stops and nothing's the same again. And that was absolutely the case for me with Will, and then again with Imogen. And I mean, you brought up this visceral tirade of, out of our control environmental stresses that we've had this year. I mean, my most significant moment of calling was on the roof of my house with a front of the Currawong fire bearing down on us. And then I live in the Shoalhaven, so we copped a lot of that flood activity as well. And then, leading a little business, doing what we do with leaders on a nice exponential growth curve up until COVID. So, right in the midst of this absolute torrent of sort of negative experience, I, like you, have absolutely doubled down on this, on what we're doing. And to reference another podcast guest, Paul Dunn, for me, purpose has provided certainty. With nothing, that's anticipatable, nothing that's predictable in any sense, the one thing I can do is get up out of the bed every day and go out and make the world better in however way I can, right? And there's nothing out of my control when it comes to just that one foot in front of the other, small change, progressive action towards this purpose. So glad that we're on the journey. Would you have any specific views on what you would say the role of a leader could be in making the transition? What would the small actionable steps be that you would recommend somebody could do if they want to be a leader who leads to make the world better?
I think probably the most important thing that I would say is that you don't have to change where you work in order to lead with purpose. I think all of us have the opportunity to bring purpose into what we do in our day-to-day. Some of us have the luxury to be able to, work in companies like I do where purpose is at the core. But even if you don't, I think you still have an opportunity to have influence. And I get a lot of questions from people who are earlier on in their career who, want to know how they can help their organizations be more carbon neutral or climate friendly. And I think, at the end of the day, anyone can ask a question, and there's so much power in that. And I think leaders at all levels can do the same. What would it look like for this company that I work for to really mean what we say we mean? What would it look like for this bank to really be customer centric? Well, it probably wouldn't look like 30-page legal documents that no one's ever going to understand. So, all of those little things I think that we just take for granted in our workday, they're actually all on the table, and there's an opportunity to bring purpose into all of those little decisions and interactions as well. I think for me, one of the things that's been really informative for me at Future Super and how I think about integrating purpose is really thinking through who's going to be the judge of whether or not we are living our purpose in the way we run this business. And then thinking from the perspective of each of those stakeholder groups, how can I make sure that I show them that we do live our purpose? And I think, again, that's something that any company can do. What does it look like to really live your purpose and live your marketing spin for your employees? What does it look like to really deliver on your marketing spin for your customers? What does it look like to do that for the broader community, for other business leaders who are your peers? What does it look, and I think we spend a lot of focus thinking about how do we deliver value for shareholders within corporate Australia. I imagine corporate overseas as well. But again, I think there's this real opportunity to think about shareholders more broadly, particularly, as I said before, superannuation funds hold around about half of all of the shares on the stock exchange. So superannuation funds are shareholders. Superannuation funds are nothing but a collection of money owned by their members, and the members are the community. So it's all this big circle that comes back together. So I think for leaders of big businesses within Australia in particular, thinking more broadly than just shareholder returns, but who are those shareholders and what are all of the different roles that those people hold? How can I show value to them and show purpose to them across all of those roles? I would absolutely love to see more consideration like that.
Yeah, I'm going to give you another one. I love all of that. I'm going to give you another one because this was the thing that basically made me stand up, sit up, get up, whichever it was, and pay attention to you. And it's one that you've listed in some of the preparation that you've done for today, which is think bravely. And that was a specific phrase that you coined. because it was your bravery, as the leader of any organisation, to be publicly vocal about something that was so anti what you stand for, and therefore very much what you stand against, and not only really call out the behaviour of what is, let's face it, an iconic Australian business in Rio, but also call out your peers, your fellow fund managers, for continuing to do nothing, say nothing. So that bravery, obviously conveyed in an extremely professional but evocative way. I think that, for me, like, those are the small rocks that begin the avalanche, right? Like, that made me stand up and go, hang on a minute, this Kirstin Hunter's really about what she says she's about. So I'm just going to put that one on you, and then say, good on you, and what do you think about thinking bravely, and how would you suggest people could do that if you agree it's something that's important for them to do?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that specific thing was in response to Rio Tinto's destruction of the Aboriginal historical sites at the Jukan Gorge. And the particular comment that you're referring to was calling out members of the superannuation industry who are investors in Rio, who market themselves on their ethics, but then continue to invest in these companies that are not only extracting fossil fuels and having a horrendous effect on the environment, but also, on the other hand, committing these horrific acts of cultural destruction. And the reason that's often given by other investors for continuing to invest in companies like Rio, BHP, the tobacco industry, even though we know the negative effects of what they do, is that by holding that investment, it allows those super funds to have a seat at the table as a shareholder and to influence those companies to be more ethical. So, I mean, what really pushed me to the edge on that was just the silence in the industry from investors in Rio after that event. There was just nothing. No one was condemning them. It was just all public outrage, but none of the investors were making any kind of statements at all. And I just thought, like, if you're investing to influence, now's the time. Now's the time to show your influence and to show how you're going to make sure that this never happens again. Since that time, there has been a couple of the super funds who've off the back of that act by Rio, have started introducing charters around how they engage with, or how they expect their invested companies to engage with Indigenous populations. So I think that is a really positive step. But again, I think engagement is meaningless if you don't actually engage. And there's been a lot of research as well which shows that, super funds who say that they continue to hold these shares in order to engage and to influence towards a carbon neutral or sort of lower carbon operation within these major fossil fuel companies, that they then decline the opportunity to vote when climate resolutions are put to AGMs, or they decline the opportunity to exercise their shareholder vote to vote in favour of those resolutions. So again, you're holding this investment, you're justifying it on the basis of it allows you to engage, but then you're declining the opportunity to engage. And so to me, I think that it does come back to this question of bravery and being able to imagine the future that we want to see. I think there's a lot of inertia in corporations, in investors, of just, this is just the way things are, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think all of us in positions of leadership, whether we're in a superannuation fund with $1 billion under management or a superannuation fund with $130 billion under management, it shouldn't matter. All of us in the superannuation industry have a responsibility to provide outcomes for our members at their retirement. So what kind of world do we want to be leaving them in 50 years' time, or 20 years' time, or 5 years' time, by the time they're able to access the money that we've held on behalf of them? How can we imagine that? And then how can we make decisions today that will deliver that world, instead of just making decisions based on the way things have always been done? And I think that willingness to step outside of the received wisdom, the way things always have been done, has a lot to do with bravery, but it shouldn't be. We just should all make decisions based around the world that we want to see, rather than sort of allowing ourselves to be victims to the system and blaming the system, when actually we have an opportunity to change the system. The system is nothing but the collection of all of our actions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is a concise and eloquent depiction of, I can now come full circle, the reason why I was so much looking forward to spending some time with you today. Because to my definition, and in the work that I do and the leader that I am, my definition of leadership is not one of status, it's not one of position, it's not one of hierarchy. It could be one of compounded experience, but it certainly is one of authority. Leadership for me is about who you are, how you live that, and what you do. And this is why I've been so impressed with you from the outset. You are who you are. You're very upfront about that, and what you do really stands by what you believe and your values and so on and so on. And ultimately, what you're trying to design is a mechanism through the success of your organisation that shows that others can lead by doing in a comparable way, and that is the way we're going to shift the dial on this whole situation.
That's exactly right. One of my big mantras is around actions, not words. And actually, I have, you can see people on the video, maybe not quite, but I have this tattoo which is an image from the suffrage movement. And it's a catch cry from the suffrage movement 100 years ago: deeds, not words. We want to see the vote. We don't want you to just talk about women's equality, but not actually put that in practice. And to me, that has just really informed the approach that I've taken as a leader, and the approach that I take through Future Super of, again, our purpose is not just words on a wall. It's not just marketing spin. We show our purpose through our actions. We don't tell our purpose by saying the words.
Perfect. So if people are inspired and they are curious and they want to find out more about you and Future Super, what's the best way for them to do that and interact with you?
Probably the easiest thing is to jump onto our website, which is futuresuper.com.au. Follow us on socials. I'm also on LinkedIn. I don't sort of publish all that regularly, but I'm happy to accept follow requests. But our Future Super socials are a really great source of information about what's happening within the ethical investing space, what's happening more broadly within corporate Australia, and what's happening within the superannuation space.
Awesome. Well, I'll get all of that stuff in the show notes. So if you're listening to this, it's as easy as scroll down and click, and away you go. And really just one final question and an invitation for a parting call to action for whomever is the recipient of this. What's the one thing that you would suggest someone could do right now to follow any of your examples or advice and make a change for the good?
I think the simplest thing that anyone can do right now is just to take 5 minutes and think about what is the world that you want to see. And then once you've got that vision of the world you want to see, what are the things that are within your control that you can start to change in order to put yourself on the path towards that world? I think whether that applies to your personal life, in your consumer decisions, whether it applies to your decision about where to work, whether it applies to your behaviour within your work day, I think all of us can act a little bit more with foresight around where we're going to make sure that the decisions we make today have a positive impact on the world that we inherit tomorrow.
Perfect. I'm not even going to try to add to that. That's perfect. Kirstin, thank you very much for spending some time with us and sharing your wisdom and advice with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
You'll find audio and video recordings for this episode, as well as links and related resources mentioned today in the podcast area of foreyleadership.com/insights. This is the Better World Leaders podcast, brought to you by 4i Leadership.